July 1588. 130 Spanish warships were sailing toward England, carrying 30,000 men, with one mission: invade, conquer, and return England to Catholic rule under Spanish dominion. If they succeeded, there would be no British Empire, no English colonies in America, no global naval power, just another Spanish possession, ruled from Madrid, its Protestant population suppressed or eliminated. But they didn't succeed, and what stopped them wasn't just English courage or superior tactics. It was a combination of naval warfare, weather, and a series of catastrophic Spanish decisions that turned the most powerful fleet ever assembled into a disaster that would haunt Spain for generations. This is the story of the Spanish Armada, and what you're about to discover will show you how one summer changed the course of world history, how a small island nation defeated a superpower and began its rise to global dominance. Welcome to Britain's history. Today, we're diving into the battle that saved Protestant England and launched the nation toward empire. Because the defeat of the Spanish Armada wasn't just about ships and storms, it was about religion, politics, personal vendettas, and the birth of English naval supremacy that would dominate the world for 3 centuries. But before we get to those burning ships in the English Channel, before we watch the greatest fleet ever assembled disintegrate in storms and panic, we need to understand why Spain wanted to invade England in the first place. Because without knowing what brought 130 ships to England's shores, you can't truly appreciate the stakes of what followed. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as dramatic as the Armada. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1558, when Elizabeth I became Queen of England. She inherited a kingdom torn by religious conflict, economically weak, and internationally isolated. Her half-sister Mary I had tried to restore Catholicism by force, burning hundreds of Protestants at the stake and marrying Philip II of Spain. When Mary died childless and Elizabeth took the throne, she faced an impossible situation. Elizabeth was Protestant, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, a marriage the Catholic Church never recognized, making Elizabeth illegitimate in Catholic eyes. Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law, initially proposed marriage to Elizabeth, hoping to keep England in the Catholic sphere. Elizabeth refused. She would never marry, she declared, instead becoming the Virgin Queen, married to England itself. Philip took this rejection badly, very badly. Think about Elizabeth's choice for a moment. Marry Philip and England stays Catholic under Spanish influence. Refuse him and face inevitable war with Europe's superpower. She chose independence over safety. Would you have made the same decision? Drop your thoughts in the comments. For the next 30 years, tensions between England and Spain escalated. Elizabeth supported Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands, who were fighting for independence from Catholic Spanish rule. English privateers, essentially government-sanctioned pirates like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, raided Spanish treasure ships returning from the Americas, stealing gold and silver that Spain needed to fund its wars. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580 wasn't just exploration. It was a 3-year raiding expedition against Spanish possessions. Spain was the superpower of the 16th century. Its empire stretched across the Americas, the Philippines, parts of Italy, and the Netherlands. Spanish silver from South American mines funded the largest army in Europe. The Spanish infantry were considered invincible. Spanish ships carried the wealth of the New World. And Philip II, ruling from his palace monastery El Escorial outside Madrid, saw himself as God's instrument to defend Catholicism against Protestant heresy. Elizabeth's England, by contrast, was small, relatively poor, and militarily weak on land. But England had advantages Spain underestimated. English sailors had been raiding Spanish possessions for years, gaining experience in naval warfare and navigation. English shipwrights had developed faster, more maneuverable vessels than the Spanish galleons. And England had something Spain lacked: desperation. If Spain invaded successfully, Protestantism in England would be crushed, Elizabeth would be executed, and Catholic rule restored. The English knew they were fighting for survival. The final trigger came in 1587. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's Catholic cousin and rival claimant to the English throne, was implicated in yet another assassination plot against Elizabeth. After years of keeping Mary under house arrest, Elizabeth finally authorized her execution. Mary was beheaded on February 8, 1587. Philip II of Spain, who'd been contemplating an invasion for years, now had his justification and his cause. He would invade England, depose the Protestant usurper, and restore Catholicism. It would be a holy crusade blessed by the Pope. Philip began assembling the largest naval force ever seen. He called it the Grande y Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate fleet. History would call it the Spanish Armada. The plan was straightforward. The Armada would sail from Spain to the Netherlands, pick up an additional 30,000 Spanish soldiers under the Duke of Parma, Spain's best general commanding Spain's best troops, then cross the Channel and invade England. Spanish infantry would crush whatever resistance the English could muster. Elizabeth would be captured or killed. A Catholic monarch would be installed. England would return to the Catholic faith and Spanish influence. The Armada assembled in Lisbon throughout 1587 and early 1588. It consisted of approximately 130 ships of various types: massive galleons carrying heavy cannon, smaller warships, supply vessels, and troop transports. About 30,000 men sailed with the fleet, 8,000 sailors, and 19,000 soldiers, plus officers, priests, and support personnel. They carried enough supplies for 6 months. The firepower was immense. The scale was unprecedented. Nothing like this had been attempted since ancient times. Command of the Armada went to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a Spanish nobleman with virtually no naval experience. This wasn't Philip's first choice. His preferred admiral, the Marquis of Santa Cruz, had died in February 1588 during preparations. Medina Sidonia actually begged Philip not to give him the command, writing that he lacked experience, got seasick, and didn't believe the invasion would succeed. Philip appointed him anyway. Medina Sidonia was loyal, conscientious, and would follow orders. Philip believed that was enough. In April 1588, Francis Drake led a daring raid on Cadiz harbour, where part of the Armada was assembling. Drake's ships attacked the anchored Spanish vessels, destroyed supplies, and delayed the invasion by months. Drake called it singeing the King of Spain's beard. Philip was furious, but the delay might have actually helped Spanish preparations. Finally, on May 28, 1588, the Armada sailed from Lisbon. The fleet was so large, it took 2 days for all ships to clear the harbour. Priests blessed the expedition. Sailors and soldiers took communion. Philip's orders were clear: sail to the Netherlands, rendezvous with Parma's army, invade England, restore Catholicism. God would ensure victory. The voyage immediately encountered problems. Storms scattered the fleet off the Portuguese coast. Ships were damaged, supplies were ruined. The Armada had to put in to the Spanish port of Corunna for repairs, not reaching the English Channel until July 19th. By then, the English were ready. England's naval defences were commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Francis Drake as Vice Admiral and other experienced captains like John Hawkins and Martin Frobisher. The English fleet was smaller than the Spanish, perhaps 80 to 90 warships, plus auxiliaries. But the ships were different. English galleons were longer, lower, faster, and more maneuverable than Spanish vessels. English naval cannon had longer range. English crews had more gunnery experience. The English strategy was to avoid close combat, where Spanish soldiers could board their ships, instead using superior speed and long-range cannon to damage the Armada from a distance. On July 19th, the Armada was spotted off the Cornish coast. Beacons were lit across England, spreading the alarm. Elizabeth's army mobilized. The English fleet, which had been waiting at Plymouth, worked frantically to get to sea before the Spanish could trap them in harbour. According to legend, Drake was playing bowls when news of the Armada arrived and insisted on finishing his game before sailing. Probably apocryphal, but it captures the English determination to appear calm under pressure. The running battle that followed lasted 9 days, from July 21st to July 29th, as the Armada sailed up the English Channel toward its rendezvous with Parma's army. The English harried the Spanish fleet continuously, attacking from long range, damaging ships, but never delivering a decisive blow. The Spanish sailed in a tight defensive formation, the crescent, that was difficult to break. Spanish gunnery was less effective than English. Spanish cannon were designed for close-range combat, not long-range dueling. Spanish soldiers wanted to board English ships and fight hand-to-hand, but the faster English vessels stayed just out of reach. Several small engagements occurred. English ships picked off stragglers. Spanish ships occasionally turned to fight, but the English would slip away before the Spanish could close. Neither side achieved a decisive advantage. The Spanish kept sailing toward their objective. The English kept attacking, but couldn't stop them. It was a strange, inconclusive running battle, unlike anything naval warfare had seen before. By July 27th, the Armada reached Calais, anchoring in the roads to await word from the Duke of Parma about the invasion force that was supposed to join them. This was the critical moment. If Parma's 30,000 soldiers could embark on the Armada's ships, the invasion would proceed. If not, the entire expedition had no purpose. But Parma wasn't ready. His army was besieging several Dutch towns and couldn't easily disengage. His transport barges were stuck in canals miles from the coast, blockaded by Dutch rebel ships. He needed time to assemble his forces, time the Armada didn't have. The fleet was anchored in an exposed position, running low on ammunition from the week of fighting, and the wind was pushing them toward the treacherous sandbanks of the Flemish coast. The English commanders saw their opportunity. On the night of July 28th, they sent fireships into the anchored Spanish fleet. Fireships were vessels loaded with pitch, tar, gunpowder, and anything flammable, set alight and sailed toward enemy ships. The unmanned burning vessels drifted into the tightly packed Spanish formation. Spanish lookouts saw them coming and raised the alarm. Panic spread through the Armada. Captains, terrified that the fireships carried explosives that would detonate on contact, cut their anchor cables and scattered in the darkness. The carefully maintained defensive formation disintegrated. Ships collided in the dark. Several ran aground on sandbanks. By dawn on July 29th, the Armada was scattered along the Flemish coast in complete disarray. Only a handful of the fireships actually hit Spanish vessels, but the psychological damage was devastating. The English attacked at dawn. The Battle of Gravelines on July 29th was the decisive engagement. The Spanish fleet, scattered and disorganized, tried to reform its defensive formation. English ships closed to effective cannon range and pounded the Spanish vessels for 8 hours. This time, the English were close enough that their superior gunnery made a real difference. Spanish ships were hulled repeatedly. Masts came down. Some ships were sinking. Spanish soldiers fired muskets uselessly at English vessels that stayed just beyond boarding range. The fighting was brutal. One Spanish galleon, the San Lorenzo, ran aground and was captured. Several others were crippled. Spanish ammunition was running desperately low. They'd expended most of their powder and shot in the previous week of fighting and hadn't anticipated such prolonged combat. English ships, able to resupply from nearby ports, kept up relentless fire. By afternoon, the Spanish were defeated, though not destroyed. Medina Sidonia managed to pull together a ragged formation and sailed north, away from the English coast, pursued by the English fleet. The Armada was now in an impossible position. They were too damaged to fight effectively. They'd failed to rendezvous with Parma. The wind was blowing them north, away from the Channel and Spain. They couldn't sail back through the Channel past the English fleet. Their only option was to sail around Scotland and Ireland, then south to Spain. A journey of thousands of miles through some of the most dangerous waters in Europe, undertaken by damaged ships with depleted supplies. Medina Sidonia ordered the fleet north. The English pursued for a while, then broke off when it became clear the Armada was fleeing. But the Spanish ordeal was just beginning. The voyage around Scotland was relatively uneventful. But when the Armada rounded the northern coast and turned south along Ireland's western coast, disaster struck. Storms, the same Atlantic gales that make Ireland's west coast treacherous, battered the Spanish fleet. Ships that had been damaged at Gravelines began taking on water. Others were driven onto rocky coasts. Crews were exhausted, hungry, and dying of disease. Water supplies were fouled. Food was running out. Ships began sinking or wrecking on the Irish coast. The Spanish who made it ashore in Ireland faced another nightmare. Some were helped by the local Irish, who were mostly Catholic and had no love for English Protestant rule. But many more were killed by English forces in Ireland or by Irish who feared English reprisals for helping Spaniards. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers drowned or were killed in Ireland. Their bodies washed up on beaches for weeks. Wrecks littered the coast. By the time the remnants of the Armada limped back to Spain in September and October 1588, the defeat was total. Of 130 ships that had sailed in May, only about 60 returned. Perhaps half the men who'd left Spain came home. Estimates of Spanish casualties range from 15,000 to 20,000 dead, most from shipwreck, disease, and drowning rather than combat. The greatest fleet ever assembled had disintegrated. Spain's aura of invincibility was shattered. England lost no ships in combat, and fewer than 100 men killed in the fighting, though many more died later from disease. It was one of the most one-sided strategic victories in naval history. England had defeated a superpower and emerged as a naval force to be reckoned with. But the Armada's defeat wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological and political earthquake. Protestant England had faced Catholic Europe's greatest power and won. Elizabeth I became a national hero, the queen who'd rallied her nation against impossible odds. Her speech to troops at Tilbury, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too," became legendary, embodying English defiance. The defeat changed Spain's trajectory. Philip II wouldn't give up. He launched two more, smaller armadas in 1596 and 1597, both scattered by storms before reaching England. But Spanish resources were overstretched. The endless war in the Netherlands continued draining Spanish treasure. Spain remained powerful, but the myth of Spanish invincibility was broken. Other nations saw that Spain could be challenged, defeated, beaten. For England, the Armada's defeat opened possibilities that had seemed impossible before. English privateers raided Spanish possessions with renewed confidence. English merchants expanded trade routes. English colonists began settling in North America. The first permanent English colony, Jamestown, was founded in 1607, less than 20 years after the Armada. The English Navy, which had proven its effectiveness, became the focus of national investment. Ships, sailors, naval infrastructure. England began building the navy that would eventually rule the waves. The battle also demonstrated the importance of ship design and tactics. The English had proven that faster, more maneuverable ships with longer range cannon could defeat larger, heavily armed vessels built for close combat. This lesson shaped naval warfare for centuries. The age of the lumbering galleon, packed with soldiers, was ending. The age of the purpose-built warship, designed for gun combat and speed, was beginning. But we should be careful about oversimplifying. The Spanish Armada wasn't destroyed by English naval superiority alone. Weather played a crucial role. The storms that wrecked Spanish ships off Ireland killed more Spaniards than English cannon. Spanish logistics were inadequate for such a long, complex operation. The failure to coordinate with Parma's army was fatal. Medina Sidonia, for all his conscientiousness, wasn't the admiral Spain needed. The plan itself had fundamental flaws that better execution might have mitigated, but probably couldn't have overcome. And from the Spanish perspective, the disaster was more about what went wrong than about English superiority. Spanish reports focused on the storms, the navigation failures, The supply problems. Many Spaniards believed that if the weather had been better, if Parma had been ready, if the fireships hadn't scattered the fleet at Calais, the invasion might have succeeded. They weren't entirely wrong. The Armada came closer to success than English histories sometimes admit. Yet the outcome remains. England survived, Spain was defeated, and the balance of power shifted. The consequences rippled through history. If the Armada had succeeded, there would be no British Empire, no English colonization of North America, no global English-speaking culture. The modern world would look completely different. One summer in 1588 determined whether England would remain an independent Protestant nation or become a Catholic province of Spain. This was the first step. Britain's path to global dominance began here, but it would take another 200 years and dozens more battles to cement that supremacy. Trafalgar, Plassey, Waterloo. The empire was built one victory at a time, and we're covering them all. Within a generation of the Armada's defeat, England was establishing colonies in North America. Within a century, the English Navy was challenging Dutch and French fleets for control of global trade routes. Within 2 centuries, Britannia ruled the waves, and the British Empire spanned the globe. And it all began in the summer of 1588, when 130 Spanish ships sailed toward England and only 60 came home. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. What other battles shaped Britain's rise to power? The conquest of India, Trafalgar, Waterloo, the forgotten victories that built an empire. Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.